G'day, mate 40 here. So why is it that conservatives, just regular old conservatives who worked as plumbers, right? Conservatives who worked as nursing aides, conservatives who worked as garbage collectors, right? How come millions of conservatives in low status professions were able to spot Joe Biden's cognitive decline many years before high status elite, far more intelligent liberals were able to see that? And this is not a dunk on liberals show, right? I try to rise above partisanship while acknowledging that I am right-wing. And I think one reason that conservatives were able to see Joe Biden's cognitive decline before liberals is that liberals, particularly liberal elites, have much more of a dedication to facts in some things than do conservatives. So I believe, tell me if I'm wrong, but for conservatives, common sense is something that an individual with a room temperature IQ or above can display from his own life experiences. So conservatives with a 100 IQ, they saw video of Joe Biden or they heard Joe Biden and they thought this is a senile old man. Liberals, on the other hand, I think for liberals, smart, intelligent, intellectual liberals, common sense is the consensus of expertise. So take the COVID vaccine, right? So for many conservatives, it felt like the opposite of common sense to take this new vaccine. Why would they want to import that into their body? But for liberals, they accepted the medical consensus that this was a good thing to do. And so I believe that liberals, by and large, reacted to COVID in a saner and more effective way than did conservatives. On the other hand, conservatives were able to see that Joe Biden had such dramatic cognitive decline that he was not fit to be president of the United States. And conservatives could see this many years before liberals came around to it. Now, the mainstream media have come around to it, and they're embarrassed, right? Because it appears that they've been carrying water for Joe Biden, and part of their inclination, perhaps, to not pursue this story is that they regard Donald Trump as a deadly threat to the country. Also, they have a much higher bar for what's a fact. So just you as an individual looking at Joe Biden and making a judgment, he's obviously in cognitive decline. All right, that is not a fact in a liberal conception because you have no medical training, right? You don't have the capability of being a medical expert and diagnosing Joe Biden. Now, I'm not a big fan of Will Cain, who you're seeing on the screen right now, even though I agree with Will Cain on almost everything, but he just takes the easy way out, like Ben Shapiro and almost all conservative pundits, lambasting the mainstream media for their failure to cover Joe Biden's cognitive decline. Well, the conservative media had every opportunity to cover the same story, and they never did it in any comprehensive, fact-based fashion. All right, putting together various videos and saying this is obviously a senile old man. All right, that does not constitute a fact in elite discourse, right? And conservatives, Republicans, they had every opportunity to nail down and document this story, right? Joe Biden has had obvious symptoms of senility since at least 2018. And so Republicans could have spent $100,000, hired some good investigative reporters, and definitively nailed this story down so that the mainstream media would have to pay attention, just as the bloke behind the Breitbart for a while, and he ran Donald Trump's campaign in 2016, and now he's been sentenced to 4 months in jail. Oh my God, I'm having a senior moment. All right, he hired people to do a definitive story on Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation's corruption, and because it was nailed down in a fact-based, Steve Bannon, right? Because it was nailed down in a fact-based manner, right? It had sway in the conventional news media. Republicans could have done the same thing. So Will Cain, right, podcast host, and Hugh Hewitt, podcast host, saying Joe Biden is senile. That is not nailing the story down. That's just giving your opinion. That's just displaying your common sense. but you're not conveying facts to an elite liberal university educated audience. All right, your understanding from looking at videos that Joe Biden is senile, all right, that's not a fact from an elite perspective, right? That is just your feeling, right? And feelings are not facts, as Ben Shapiro reminds us. So let's get a handle on what's going on with the mainstream media. They are deeply embarrassed by this story. All right, they look really bad. So Jackie at Fox News does great work.
Called for Biden to drop out, and also expressions of concern. Really just a note of the moment that we are in. It didn't include the latest call for him to drop. This came just last hour from Massachusetts Congressman Seth Moulton. He wrote, "When your current strategy isn't working, it's rarely the right decision to double down. President Biden is not going to get younger. I'm taking time to seriously consider the best strategy for Democrats to win this election and set our country on a positive path forward." That statement comes right after House Democratic leadership held a conference call this evening following reports that members are circulating 2 letters, one calling for Biden to drop out if the next few days don't go well, and the other demanding it. The Biden campaign is also denying that there's a succession plan underway should President Biden decide to step aside. CNN reported that Biden would first throw his support behind Vice President Harris, and then former presidents and party leaders would follow suit to stave off a contentious fight for the ticket. The campaign tells Fox there is, quote, literally zero truth to this report. But the Biden campaign co-chair is openly voicing his support for a mini primary if President Biden calls it quits.
You can actually fashion the process that's already in place to make it a mini primary, and I would support that, absolutely. I think that Kamala Harris would acquit herself very well in that kind of a process, but then it would be fair to everybody. So all of the other governors who may be interested.
We haven't yet seen the full impact of this debate on the polling, on the fundraising, never mind the increasing calls for Biden to drop coming from editorial boards like the Boston Globe put out today. And this moment from the Democratic governors who met with the president, 22 of them, not hearing that he's in it firmly until the third speaker really means this question continues into tomorrow, Will.
All right, Jackie, welcome to the break in the news cycle. Happy 4th of July. Thank you, Jackie.
You too.
And by the way, every 4th of July week, I find myself sitting around a fire, checking my phone.
Oh, great. That's good to know, Will Kane. So glad to know what you do on the 4th of July. All right. Why did regular 100 IQ conservative see Joe Biden's dramatic cognitive decline years before the liberal elite? Right. So part of the reason is also partisan, right? People who are your enemy, all right, they're much more willing to tell you harsh truths than your friends. So I found that I often get much more truth from my harshest enemies than I do from my best friends. All right, here is a classic example of the liberal elite versus conservative politician perspective on Joe Biden, all right? So Joe Biden is set to do his first post-debate interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos. Here is George Stephanopoulos shouting over Nikki Haley last year when Nikki Haley questioned Biden's ability to finish a second term. How do you know Joe Biden is not going to finish his term? What is that based on? So from a liberal perspective, there's simply a lack of facts here. All right. Some of these interactions with the Biden press corps are pretty funny. They asked Biden to come down, and one reporter says, is he awake?
Last night at the fundraiser, the president blamed jet lag for his debate performance, but he was back stateside for well over a week. So does he really need more than a week and a half to recover from traveling in Europe?
He owned that the debate was not his best night, and he said himself it's not an excuse, but it's an explanation.
You did get numerous questions yesterday about the president's debate performance. You didn't mention travel, the jet lag, the foreign trip. So I think you can understand why it was a little bit puzzling to hear the president mentioning that as his explanation for the first time last night.
And I want to say that is my bad. I did know that, but we were so focused. I was so focused on the cold.
Is President Biden considering stepping down?
Absolutely not.
Every summer we do stories about sharks and shark attacks.
Okay, so here's a classic story where George Stephanopoulos goes up against Nikki Haley and says, on what basis do you say he's not going to finish his term? So let's play this classic video. It illustrates a different attitude towards facts between conservatives and liberals.
There is no way that Joe Biden's going to finish his term. I think Kamala Harris is going to be the next president, and that should send a chill up every American spine. But I also think the fact that we have a primary.
Excuse me, 1 second, Ambassador. How do you know that Joe Biden's not going to finish his term? What is that based on?
Ask Americans, do you think he...
So what is that based on? So for conservatives, it's based on common sense. But for liberals like George Stephanopoulos, common sense is that which is the consensus of those with expertise in the area.
He's going to finish his term? Do you think that he's actually going to finish what he started? We look at the decline he's had over the last few years. You have to be honest with the American people, George.
Again, you didn't answer the question. What evidence do you have that he's not going to finish the term? If what Americans feel has no basis on whether he's going to finish his term or not.
See, what Americans feel has no basis on whether Joe Biden is going to finish his term or not. Well, it has no basis if it's removed from reality. But the common sense of Americans was far closer to reality than the sophistication of high IQ liberal elites. All right, George Stephanopoulos has scorn for this perspective offered in 2023 when it had been obvious for 5 years that Joe Biden was in a cognitive decline downward spiral. Right, it'd been obvious for 5 years. And he is demanding evidence, right? Because he wants facts, because this is his hero system, all right? Respect for facts, and facts require the experts to come out and declare something following proper protocol.
The American people know it.
You agree
and
with Joe Biden on Ukraine,
don't you? We need a new generational
you?
leader who is at the top of their game.
I was watching the debate. You agree with what he's doing on Ukraine.
So on what basis? All right, feelings are not facts. Right? That's George Stephanopoulos giving the Ben Shapiro treatment that feelings are not facts. So there's something of a contempt, all right, among the liberal elite for the unwashed and their notions of common sense. And the flip image of that contempt is Dennis Prager saying studies either back up what is common sense to me or they're wrong, right? And that's not true. I don't come down on either side. Sometimes common sense is right. Sometimes expertise is right. I believe the liberal left was far more realistic with regard to the COVID threat and how to deal with it than were conservatives. On the other hand, with regard to transsexual surgeries and with regard to same-sex marriage, and with regard to Joe Biden's obvious cognitive decline, conservative common sense, I think, wins out against the liberal elite. What else is going on here?
Speaking directly and engaging with his supporters and then spend time with his family. I think what's important is that he has done this outreach. He's having these conversations.
Busy recovering from the debate with Hunter and
Okay, so FoxNews.com reported today former Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley dunked on ABC's George Stephanopoulos after their tense exchange last year about President Biden's mental acuity resurfaced on Tuesday. During an interview last August on Good Morning America, Haley repeated her assertion that a vote for Joe Biden is a vote for Kamala Harris. There's no way Joe Biden is going to finish his term, Haley said. Kamala Harris is going to be the next president, and that should send a chill up every American spine. But also think the fact that we have a primary. Excuse me, Stephanopoulos interrupted with a scowl on his face. How do you know Joe Biden's not going to finish his term? What is that based on? So common sense doesn't count. That is not a proper basis from George Stephanopoulos and the liberal elite perspective. Ask Americans, do you think he's going to finish his term? Do you think that he's actually going to finish what he started? Haley responded. We look at the decline he's had over the last few years. You have to be honest with the American people, George. There's no way that Joe Biden is going to finish out next term. We can't have an 81-year-old president. We have to have a new generational leader. Again, you didn't answer the question, Stephanopoulos pushed back. What evidence, right? What evidence do you have that he's not going to finish his term? What Americans feel has no basis on whether he's going to finish his term or not. All right, is that true? Sometimes what Americans feel does have a basis. It turns out in this area, what Americans felt with regard to Joe Biden had far more of a basis than all of the high IQ, liberal, mainstream media elite perspective. All right, 100 IQ conservative plumbers had more wisdom on this than 150 IQ liberal elite TV anchors. So conservatives have more faith in the common sense of ordinary people than do liberals. Liberals want studies. Liberals want science. Right? Liberals believe more in science than in common sense. Right? Liberals wanted to wait for credentialed medical elites following protocol to declare Joe Biden unfit for office. Right? Regular people didn't wait for expertise. All right? People on the conservative end of the spectrum are much less likely to wait for expertise. So let's see what else is going on in the mainstream media today.
Over the weekend, it won't be enough to assure the American people.
Look, I think they've got to do a lot of stuff. They've got to get him out there this week. He has to show people that he is strong. They should have prepared us for a raspy voice on Thursday night, to be perfectly frank, and nobody did. So one interview isn't going to fix this either.
Nothing that's been happening is encouraging. And so, we all love George Stephanopoulos, and that's great. But, it's got to be a lot more than that. It's got to be a barnstorm. It's got to be town halls in hostile environments, probably like Fox News, and show us you could make the case.
Most people had.
So why isn't Joe Biden doing these things? Because he's not cognitively capable, right? The guy's only got about 6 hours a day of stamina to work. So yeah, I hope we don't get into a national security crisis. The media can't keep hiding the truth about Biden. Well, what did you do, Will Cain? Right? You did nothing to move the story forward. You made remarks on your podcast that Joe Biden's in obvious cognitive decline, but that's not establishing the story. You could have built the story, and you failed to. So I have no time for conservatives pointing out, the liberal media, they were rallying around Joe Biden. They ignored this obvious story because nobody in the conservative media built this story. Right? They could have spent the time, they could have gone to the effort to establish facts on the ground with regard to Joe Biden's cognitive decline, and they did not. Right? So regular people didn't wait for the expertise. They trusted what they saw, and they trusted in their common sense. So liberals are children of the Enlightenment, right? They have more respect for facts, right, in those parts of life that don't touch on their sacred values than do conservatives. So common sense for conservatives means something that strikes you, the individual, as obvious. For liberals, common sense means the consensus of experts. So without medical experts following protocol, diagnosing Joe Biden as senile or the equivalent, right, the mainstream media wasn't going to pronounce on something that struck millions of conservatives as obvious. And as we saw in the clip of George Stephanopoulos grilling Nikki Haley, for the past 5 years, our liberal elites, particularly in the news media, with few exceptions, have tried to do everything that they can to make it socially unacceptable to declare publicly that Joe Biden is senile. So on what basis they would challenge conservatives, and then they would pour on the scorn. Now, however, the mainstream media is embarrassed, humiliated, and angry. They feel like they've been caught out carrying water for Joe Biden. And another part of the reason that conservatives saw this earlier is that liberals take ableism and ageism as substantial moral categories, while conservatives, I think, are just as likely to mock these moral classifications as to revere them. So for the liberal, right, I see Daily Beast noting, reporting on anyone's old age requires extreme sensitivity. I don't think that. I don't feel that. That someone in public life, right, I don't feel like you have to use any sensitivity with regard to their old age, because there's no such moral category as ageism or ableism. Right? It would never occur to me to exercise sensitivity in reporting on a public figure's old age. To me, and I've written this often on my blog, if a public speaker looks like he is dying of AIDS, I note in my report that he looks like he's dying of AIDS. But for liberal commentators, right, ableism and ageism are very real moral categories that they don't want to fall into. So this particular liberal hero system is completely foreign to me. And you can never think straight about anything that you regard as sacred. And so if you regard the sin of ableism and ageism as a sacred sin, then you're not going to be able to think straight about it. So I Googled Trump unfit for public office, and most of the arguments boil down to moral and psychological disqualification, often referencing the diagnoses of experts who haven't examined Donald Trump, but they've got PhDs. When I Google Biden unfit for public office, I get visceral answers that are primarily physiological. So conservatives tend to trust their instincts. Liberals tend to trust expertise. So I was wondering, what does Ronnie Goldman say about this in his great work in progress, Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression? And I couldn't figure out a handle on how to dive into the book. Where in this book can I find the magic decoder ring for this Joe Biden story, and why conservatives were able to see the truth here so much more quickly than liberals? So here's what I figured out is just put in common sense, right? Liberals, common sense, conservatives vis-a-vis common sense. So I just looked for every version of common sense in his book. But I need to take a quick break.
A lot there to say. I think Israel will go to war against Hezbollah. It's just a matter of when. I think that the Israeli leaders, decision makers, would much prefer not to go anytime soon. They are winding down the war in Gaza. They're actually doing much better in Gaza than the international press would have you believe. Every one of the predictions by the Biden administration about what would happen in Israel's war in Gaza, which is a defensive war, a war in response to October 7th, virtually every one of their predictions has been wrong. They are quite effective, yet Israeli decision makers and military leaders do not want to fight a two-front war. So they want to wind down the war in Gaza before they go against Hezbollah in the north. Now, the challenge is there are tens of thousands of Israelis who live near Israel's northern border with Lebanon who have not been at home since October 7th. They're moving.
And the chat says, hey, Luke, buy silver and gold. You know what's more important than buying silver and gold? Buying time, finding time to build up your connections with your friends and your family and your community. That is a far better investment than even silver and gold.
Moved out of there. And Gallant, the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, has said he wants those families back before the school year, before the next school year. These are young Israeli children who've missed basically an entire school year by not being able to live at home. He wants them back in their homes before the next school year. So one of two things has to happen. Either Hezbollah has to pull back for that to happen, north of the Litani River, which was the UN Security Council resolution that you referenced, 1701, which Hezbollah was supposed to stay north of the Litani River, which they have not. They have violated. Either Hezbollah has to get back there, so they're not as much of a threat, an immediate threat to the Israelis living in northern Israel, or Israel has to go to war against Hezbollah. One of those two things has to happen. Now, I think Israel will go to war against Hezbollah regardless at some point, but I think the Israeli leaders want to wait till Gaza actually totally winds down, which is what we talked about in the most recent episode of my podcast, which is the IDF is basically saying we're pretty close to getting there.
And now the last question, Dan, and we can stay in the break if you have time. I know you're busy and you've got boys to take care of, is that America needs to support Israel when they go to war with Lebanon. We had the carriers there. We had two carriers there. They're gone. One is in the Red Sea, I think, but the other one is gone. Do you expect there to be an appreciable difference between a Trump 2.0 and Kamala Harris? I don't think Joe Biden's going to make it to a second term, so I'm just assuming at some point it's a Kamala Harris administration. Do you think there will be an appreciable difference between the two of those when it comes to supporting Israel in that war with Hezbollah, which is, we agree, inevitable?
Look, it's hard to predict, but if you would have told me President Biden's immediate response to supporting Israel after October 7th, I wouldn't have believed it. If you would have told me that he would have deployed the kind of resources he did after October 7th, which I think was a deterrent against Hezbollah, I wouldn't have believed it. I think the administration, the last thing they want right now is a broader regional war. I think they're doing everything possible to discourage Israel from escalating against Hezbollah. But Israel isn't escalating against Hezbollah. Hezbollah is escalating against Israel. So it's whether or not the administration is going to pressure Israel not to respond. All I can tell you with the Trump administration is based on what I know from what his last administration. I get asked this all the time. How do you think Trump will be on this issue? How do you think he'll be on that issue? I don't know. I'm not in.
Okay, let's go deeper philosophically. Why were 100 IQ conservatives better able to speak up and spot Joe Biden's cognitive decline when compared to 140 IQ liberal elites? And so I just put in common sense into Ronnie Goodman's work in progress, Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression. And there was some remarkably applicable passages. So he talks about liberals bemused incredulity toward conservative grievance, right? So you saw that in George Stephanopoulos' attitude. He had kind of a bemused incredulity towards Nikki Haley, right? It's a natural byproduct of the conservative oppression being alleged, right? Because the dominant culture's language and concepts will always privilege the perspective of its ruling elites. All right, so our dominant culture's language and concepts come from the liberal left elite, right? We are ruled by people who primarily come from the liberal left, and they then shape common sense to which oppressed groups are made to answer. So Nikki Haley had to answer the evidence questions of Judge Stephanopoulos on the basis of his conception of facts, meaning that you need medical expertise to decide to diagnose Joe Biden as unlikely to finish his term. Your feelings mean nothing, right? Your common sense means nothing in the George Stephanopoulos liberal elite perspective. So liberal elites such as George Stephanopoulos present themselves as defending uncontroversial democratic norms. But what they're really doing is exploiting the prestige of these norms, right? Norms means concepts of right and wrong, to advance their own partisan, parochial, cultural predilections as just take for granted common sense, right? Where's the evidence? Where are the facts that Joe Biden is in cognitive decline? That was the liberal left mainstream media common sense until the debate 6 days ago, right? So this new common sense consists in expert opinion and in the systematic inversion of all the values held dear by the largely powerless and often voiceless ordinary American. So the liberal elite have replaced competition and standards with bureaucratic intervention and social engineering. They've replaced patriotism by multiculturalism and anti-Americanism. They've replaced capitalism with environmentalism and socialism. They've replaced traditional morality by sexual libertinism or feminism. So the elite present themselves, people like George Stephanopoulos present themselves as public-minded pragmatists, but from a conservative perspective, they are driven by a perverse will to invert what conservatives take as right and wrong, true and false. So conservatives see Joe Biden's cognitive decline for the past 6 years, and the liberal instinct is to invert that and say, oh, where are your facts? What is the basis? You are the one who's living in a delusional world. So from a conservative perspective, the liberal elite were living in a delusional world, believing that Joe Biden was cognitively up to the task of president of the United States. But from the liberal elite perspective, they would hammer conservatives who thought that Joe Biden was cognitively checked out by demanding, where are your facts, right? These are just feelings that you have, and your feelings don't count for anything. So the anointed, right, another term for the liberal left elite coined by Thomas Sowell, they reject the common sense of the benighted. So the benighted are those who don't enjoy the liberal left hero system, right? And so the anointed, the liberal left elite, they reject the common sense of the benighted, of the conservatives, because its very commonness is an affront to their identity, right? If you're part of the elite, you're going to have disdain for that which is common. That is how it's worked in most societies throughout history, right? Everyone's looking to distinguish themselves. And one way that our elite seek to distinguish themselves is by setting themselves apart from that which is common, right? And by systematically inverting what the common people regard as right and true. So the liberal left elite identity presupposes a world that resists their prescriptions, right? A fallen world, a world too stupid and benighted and backward and medieval to recognize their superior wisdom and morality, and thus all the more in need of their instruction. So whether the issue is the rights of criminals or the rights of the homeless setting up camps on public streets or the merits of avant-garde art, right, there's always a pattern among the elite of seeking to distinguish themselves from the commoners at all costs. So they'll use terms like politics of kindness, community spirit, love of learning, right, and then reconfigure them so as to generate new gaps, new chasms between the anointed, the elite, and the common people. So liberals are always moving the goalpost because their political vision, all right, their political identity is a vision of themselves morally instructing the benighted. And this vision of the anointed never receives the lucid assent of the great majority, but most of the time it enjoys just a passive acquiescence. So liberals in the elite must always be promoting and defending, right, their enlightened perspective on the world. And this is where the intellectual class comes in, right? They have captured America's most influential institutions, including the media, Hollywood, universities, public education foundations, government bureaucracies, courts, the professions. And so from these elevated positions, right, the liberal elites use their privilege to foist their parochial same-sex, pro-trans values upon a silent and largely powerless majority of ordinary Americans. So even where democracy is not being legally disabled by the courts, so ordinary Americans in California can vote for Proposition 187 back in 1996, I believe, to bar the provision of certain welfare benefits to people in the United States illegally, but then the California Supreme Court would just overrule the will of the California people, and that is democracy, right? When the majority do not get their say if it goes against liberal left elite norms. So we have this residue of freedom where informal coercion can't completely stamp it out. So Angelo Codevilla says that the liberal left elite have inserted elite prejudice into mainstream common sense. Mainstream common sense says Joe Biden, obviously cognitively on the decline, but elite prejudice is, well, where are your facts? Where's the evidence? Now, our ruling class can't prevent us from saying Joe Biden is senile. They can't prevent us from worshiping God. But what they can do is make it as socially disabling as smoking to say these things. You have to say them furtively and with a bad conscience to declare that Joe Biden is senile until now. Right? So liberals despise unreflective, undisciplined common sense because they believe in the buffered. When I get the AI transcript, it always spells it as Buffett, B-U-F-F-E-T. No, Buffett, B-U-F-F-E-R-E-D. That's the idea that on our own, we can develop our own system of morality and meaning and purpose, and with the power of our unaided reason, we can plot a good path forward for ourselves and for society. While the traditional identity is porous, meaning that we understand that what goes on next door and across the street and in the next block and what you say to me in chat, that affects me, that I don't have a Buffett identity. I have a porous identity where everything that's going on around me affects me. So therefore, I have a strong incentive to try to reduce pollution and sources of contagion and try to maintain as much law and order and cleanliness as possible in the public square. So liberals in this conservative claims of cultural oppression mindset despise unreflective common sense because liberals venerate the Buffett identity, the morality of the courtier who takes into account every different group and how they might be affected by his words and actions. So wokeism is a secularized type of Protestantism where you have sacralized groups such as blacks and homosexuals who cannot be publicly criticized. So from a liberal left perspective, right, conservative preferences cannot be permitted to enter into utilitarian calculus because these preferences reflect a failure of liberal virtue, a failure of discipline, a failure to resist reflexive common sense. So I think Joe Biden and his supporters are probably deeply regretting that they selected Kamala Harris as his vice president. just because she fit certain demographic categories. She could identify as black because she had somewhat darker than average skin, and she's Asian, right? She has at least, one Indian parent. So another way of understanding the differences between liberals and conservatives is that liberals have the morality of the nurturing parent, meaning the mother, and conservatives have the strict father morality. But life is complicated, and so you can be a strict father in your private family life and a nurturing parent at work, or the opposite. So we all have a constellation of values. And so many academics who are politically liberal or on the left, but they have come to see academic scholarship as a version of strict father morality. So scholarly life has been neurally bound by that strict father morality. So academics see that there are intellectual authorities who maintain strict standards for the conduct of scholarly research and for reporting on such research, and that it is unscholarly for someone to violate these standards, and therefore young scholars require a rigorous training to meet these scholarly standards. So conservatives defend common sense and individual self-reliance against liberal claims of expertise and professionalism. Right? So liberals look for truth from science and from expertise. Conservatives look to common sense and tradition. So Americans originally had a self-understanding that they lived in the promised land of common sense. But our cognitive elite wants to undercut that. It wants to erode the spirit of cognitive egalitarianism, where on our own we can figure out what is true much of the time. Right? They want to move away from traditional American conceptions where the common people could figure out right and wrong and truth from falsehood. Right? Because the elite see the common people as too easily manipulated by Fox News and intellectual charlatans. The conservatives see the liberal elite as the charlatans of today, pretenders who employ their claims to intellectualism, expertise, and professionalism to cow ordinary Americans into silence and submission. So conservatives oppose the specifically left-wing cultural priorities of the anointed, and also their more general assault on cognitive egalitarianism, on the ordinary American's capacity for common sense. And that's why ordinary Americans saw that Joe Biden was cognitively impaired way before the intellectual liberal elite. So universities and the liberal emphasis on expertise wants to convert as much of the landscape as possible into fenced-off, neatly tended, carefully patrolled academic preserves, so that the smooth, manicured green lawn of science might replace the wild grass of common sense. The traditionalists believe they represent the common sense of humanity, that they are the center, and that the strict distinctions and elimination of religion from the public square means that liberal doctrines of religious neutrality unjustly compel them to undergo a cognitive dissonance with common sense. And liberals who reject that type of common sense, they are not burdened. So populists and conservatives often believe that wisdom resides with the people rather than with elites. And with regard to Joe Biden's unfitness for office, right, the people saw this years ahead of the elites. The people, whether Democrat or Republican, did not want Joe Biden to run for another term.
In his head, all you can do is, when someone's running for president, you look at what they've done in the prior office they've held. Typically, you look at, did they serve in the Senate? Did they make statements if they were a governor? That's all you can point to. With Trump, you can actually look at what he did when he was president, other than Grover Cleveland. I mean, how often can you look to someone and say, well, what did they do the last time they were president? If they've had a break since they've run. And he basically gave support to Israel full stop. And I expect they'll do the same thing. I expect he and his team and the kind of people he'd surround himself would do the same thing this time. And he alluded to that in the debate last week, that he would give Israel the resources they need to win generally. Now, he's specifically talking about the war against Hamas, but I think it would apply to any of Israel's enemies.
Dan, I listened to the Michael Murphy podcast. It's one of the few I don't like, and I like Mike a lot. I've known him for a long time, since 2008, but it was extremely cynical. And I believe he has a little bit of Trump derangement syndrome because of his biting comments about the former president. I understand that, but I don't want to be cynical about American politics. He was insufficiently shocked about the President of the United States because people have to understand. He's never actually worked in the White House, and I have, and you have, or at least you've been close to it. The president is a 24/7, 365 job. We cannot have someone who is incapacitated even occasionally as president. How shocked were you by Joe Biden's condition? Because last night on Special Report, Brett asked me if I thought he'd be the nominee. I don't think he's going to be the president by January. You've got to have capacity to do that job. So just give me your reaction as you watched that on Thursday night.
I was not shocked. I was uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable to watch, but I was not shocked. I mean, any of us who've been following the Biden presidency for a while, meaning I wouldn't say it was the entire term, but certainly over the last year, have seen versions of what we saw, although we haven't seen it in an extended 90-minute situation because he hasn't made himself available for a 90-minute, live situation. I'll tell you what I'm shocked by, Hugh. I'm shocked by the American media and the punditry's classes' reaction to it. I'm shocked that they're shocked. That's what I'm shocked about. And more reporters I've spoken to in the last few days have said to me, we really missed this one. We completely missed this one. There's clearly something wrong. It wasn't just a bad night. There's some kind of declining faculty situation going on that has probably been going on for a while, and we missed it. And now, Hugh, they're all going to cover it intensely because they feel embarrassed, they feel shocked, they feel like they hadn't been doing their job. And so you went from no reporters covering Joe Biden to God knows how many reporters are now trying to get every detail about every signal, about every breadcrumb about his condition. And so I think it makes it, I'm not saying he's not going to be president in January.
Okay, here is a major Hollywood megadonor, Ari Emmanuel, torching Joe Biden.
All right, Democrats are jumping out of the window. What are you thinking?
Well, I'm pissed off at the Founding Fathers. They had the start date of 35. They just didn't give us the end date. Everybody died, so they didn't have to give the end date. I don't want to deal with Donald Trump and what he said was true. It's a given, certain things. I'm not going to talk about CNN. Here's what Biden did. He said he was going to run for one term, and he's doing it to restore democracy. He now runs for a second term. First bit of malarkey, as he would say. Then he says that this is for it's a quintessential thought about saving democracy and so important, et cetera. His cohorts have told us that he's healthy for over a year. And I think it was 2 weeks ago, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal. And I had a father who died at 92, but at 81, I took away his car. And it's a very simple test for me. If you were driving from, anywhere they understand, from downtown Beverly Hills to Malibu, would you want Biden to do it at night? Would you want Trump to do it at night? Or neither? If the answer is neither, you cannot have them running a $27 trillion company called the United States.
Okay.
And then we sat in a situation where he went to France for the 80th anniversary and talked about the sacrifice that those soldiers made for us. So he has said, and his cohorts have said, he's the only one that has defeated Trump. It does seem like Donald Trump said, I'm the only one, I alone can make all these problems go away. And now Biden is saying, I'm the only one that can beat Trump. Seems like it's pretty similar here. And we have a great bench in the Democratic Party. And so we're looking at a man who's saying the other guy's a liar, and he's telling us malarkey. His people are.
Okay, Bill Maher. Wait. I can't play Bill Maher. I'll get a notice from HBO. My error. So doggone it. I made a mistake here. Okay, what do we got? All right, we got a throwback here to Kamala Harris coming out to greet Chris Cuomo. Who can forget this glorious time?
Good to see you, Senator. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
How are you? Anna, thank you guys. And my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
She, her, and her. Mine too.
All right, Donald Trump here on Kamala Harris.
She has some bad moments. Her moments are almost as bad as his. I think his are worse, actually.
Yeah.
But
She seems pretty senile, too.
she speaks in rhyme. It's weird. It's weird. But she has bad moments. And
in rhyme? What do you...
Well, the way she talks, the bus will go here and then the bus will go there because that's what buses do. And it's weird. The whole thing is weird. This is not a president of the United States future. And I think they probably have some.
Okay, this is Kamala Harris discovering that electricity
So
doesn't
is it
have a
plugged
smell.
into just the normal electric socket, right?
Yes, normally it's a 240 volt, but you can go ahead and plug in and
Okay.
that's it. Yeah,
There we are.
that's it.
And there's no sound or fume.
There is nothing.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's
So
all there
for
is
all of
to
us
it.
who are used to,
Every morning
to
we-
filling our tank, you usually can smell it and you can hear it. You can hear the guzzling sound.
Right.
None of that.
None of
so
that.
how do I know it's actually working?
It is. So typically once.
Okay, Kamala Harris.
And so just little, 1 minute out. I have 1 minute.
Yeah.
Kosher salt, fresh ground pepper. Maybe chop up a little thyme. And then you can mix it even with, okay, so do the salt and pepper all over it, just lather that baby up, right? With on the outside in the cavity. You could also chop up, but not with the thyme, just the salt and pepper. Mix that up also with some thyme. You could even do a little rosemary if you want. Under the skin with some butter before you're gonna cook it. So that butter will just melt in there. And then get a nice big bottle of cheap white wine to baste with butter. Yes, hi.
Okay.
Yes. Is getting a fresh turkey?
Yeah.
Okay, this is from Froome TikTok.
I'm looking for Jewish lawyer. Kippah, dimples, Torah. Lawyer, kippah, dimples, Torah. Lawyer, kippah, dimples,
This
Torah.
better get me a copyright strike. Come on now.
I'm looking for Jewish lawyer. Kippah, dimples, Torah.
All right, Joe Biden a week into office. They told
100
us this
million
is normal.
doses to be delivered this summer. And some of it will come begin to come in early summer, but by the midsummer that this vaccine will be there. And the order, and that increases the total vaccine order in the United States by 50%, from 400 million order to 600 million. This is enough vaccine to fully vaccinate 300 Americans by end of the summer, the beginning of the fall. But we want to I want to repeat, it'll be enough to fully vaccinate 300 Americans.
Okay, what about Barack Obama? Apparently his views behind the scenes are quite different than the things he says publicly. So,
It's very cute. He's putting a spin on the bottom line, but it is the bottom line. Joe's got to go. Democrats need a young, inspiring candidate who will unite the base, and there's only one person who seems to be able to do that. Michelle Obama. She's the only Democrat who's pulling ahead of Trump in the polls. And it does look to be, in that hypothetical matchup, up by 11. So could we see a full-out Obama coup? Not a chance. But look at how beloved the Obamas still are. When they speak, even behind closed doors, Democrats listen, and the message right now is loud and clear. Joe's got to go. Outkick.com founder Clay Travis joins me now. On vacation for the 4th of July. Clay Travis, putting in the work. Appreciate it, man. What do you think about the Obamas and the role they're playing behind the scenes with Biden?
I think Biden's done, Will, and thanks for having me on. Happy 4th of July to everybody out there. Hope you're having fabulous starts to your vacations and your holidays. I don't see any way that Joe Biden can be the nominee. He's going to lose. Donald Trump knocked him out. You are a big sports guy, Will. This was like Ali Frazier. They ought to go ahead and put Trump's face on Ali, if you remember that famous shot where he's got his fist in front of him and he's holding it as Frazier, I believe, is on the ground and he's knocked him out. That should be, I think, an iconic image. We've never seen anything like this in a presidential debate for a candidate to enter as potentially the favorite to win re-election and exit with his political career over. That's what we saw happen to Joe Biden. I think he's finished as we sit here 4 months out. And so Democrats are calculating. They're trying to figure out, is Kamala Harris the answer? Is Michelle Obama actually being honest? Or in her hometown of Chicago, Illinois, could she be persuaded in a contested convention to step forward? And then I think you have to think about Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, also Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan. Basically, the way it looks right now, Democrats have a very slim chance to win in the Electoral College. They got to sweep Wisconsin. They got to win Michigan. They got to win Pennsylvania. It's the Big Ten trio, just like it was in 2016, just like it was in 2020. That is their pathway to re-election. I don't see any way that Biden can run it. I don't see any way that Biden can win it. And so I think he's done.
And you know, Clay, there's a reason, and maybe it's the only reason we end up talking about Michelle Obama. You pay a lot of attention to the betting markets. The betting markets right now are favoring Kamala Harris. But the problem with Kamala Harris in any analysis, for example, by Barack Obama, who might be putting pressure to move on from Joe, is, yeah, but you're not moving off of a losing hand onto a winning hand. Kamala Harris might be the betting favorite to win the nominee or to be the nominee as a Democrat, but not to beat Donald Trump. And so it's hard to find any name, honestly, outside of Michelle Obama, where you have hope of beating Donald Trump.
It also allows Democrats, as you said, Will, to get past, in your discussion, I thought it was so well said, you've got a black woman that is the next person up. If she isn't the pick, if they move past her, if they don't respect her as the choice, then it's racist and sexist by Democrat politics standards. That is unacceptable. And so it's going to be hard to get past Kamala. That's why I've always thought Michelle Obama, as the black woman that is actually popular, that Democrats would want to vote for, makes more sense as a palatable option than Kamala Harris does. I think Kamala would end up losing worse than Biden.
I do as well, and I think it's hard to come up with a name that might beat Trump. All right, Clay, go enjoy.
Okay, I found some interesting analysis on this story that I hadn't heard before. And it's from Epsilon Theory, all right? So they look at this in terms of narrative.
It's what rational people do with each other. That's it. That's it. And there are rules to game theory. Like any game, there are rules to the game. And knowing those rules, knowing how human beings interact with each other, it gives us a lens through which to see the world, to make sense of the world when what's happening might not otherwise make sense. So,
yeah, there's no way that Hillary Clinton is running again. Too old, too frail, too pale.
I love the Emperor's New Clothes. I think it's such an important story because I think the common knowledge game that it exemplifies is, I just think it's the most important game we play as a crowd, as a social animal.
So when I was covering the pornography industry, everyone knew that Ron Jeremy was rapey, but we didn't think about him as a rapist, and no one wrote a story about Ron Jeremy rapist until Ginger Lynn came out on a podcast circa 2004 and said, Ron Jeremy raped me.
As an animal that...
And in Hollywood, like, everyone knew that Harvey Weinstein was a rapist, but it never made it into polite discourse, just as most Americans have known for many years that Joe Biden is too cognitively impaired to carry out the office of President of the United States.
That wants to be part of a group that behaves.
So what happens when something that everyone knows, but it is not publicly admitted, right? When it crosses the Rubicon to becoming publicly admitted, which is what happened with Joe Biden last Thursday night. Everyone, a vast majority of Americans who paid any attention knew that Joe Biden was checked out mentally, but it wasn't part of dominant elite discourse. But then it became common knowledge. Everyone knew it, but then it became common public knowledge.
Behaves differently when it is part of a group. And nowhere do you see the tension. The tension is the right word. Here's what I mean by the tension. The tension that the Emperor's New Clothes explains, the tension that we want to explain about what happened after the debate, is why do people act? When do people act on what they know, on what they see in the world? Because what we find, and this is again why the Emperor's New Clothes story is so good, is that people don't act, even though they know it's something important.
Right. We all knew that Ron Jeremy was rapey. We all knew that Harvey Weinstein was rapey. but no one acted on it or did anything about it in public discourse. Same with Bill Cosby. Everyone knew that he was rapey, but these rapists kept going for decades.
So, of course, the story of the emperor's new clothes, everyone can see that the emperor is naked. He's walking down the middle of the street, naked as a jaybird. And everyone in the crowd sees it. We all know he's naked. We all have that thought, the guy's naked. But we don't do anything about it. We go about our business, we applaud, we say, oh, yay, emperor.
Okay, I like Mollie Hemingway, so let's see what Mollie Hemingway has to say.
Reporting what we've been saying for years. The New York Times just put out this piece saying Biden's lapses are said to be increasingly common and worrisome. The Times says in the months leading up to the debate, several current and former officials and others who encountered him behind closed doors noticed that increasingly he appeared confused or listless or would lose the thread of conversations. So now they're changing their tune on the hoaxes they've been using to prop up Joe Biden. Less than 2 weeks ago, the New York Times wrote about cheap fakes. Videos, they said, were clearly manipulated to make him look old and confused, while others cut him out of vital context to portray him in a negative light. It's not what they're saying anymore, though. The Times now admitting, as evidenced by video footage, Mr. Biden is not the same today as he was when he took office 3.5 years ago. The recent moments of disorientation generated concern.
This is such a low IQ perspective, right? Peter Baker of the New York Times wrote the first serious story about Joe Biden's mental decline back in 2022. So the New York Times has done far better than virtually every other news outlet in covering Joe Biden's mental cognitive decline. Why hasn't Fox News covered in a serious way? Right? Why hasn't Will Cain or Mollie Hemingway created facts on the ground and advanced this story?
Among advisors and allies alike. They went from telling you not to believe your eyes to asking you to open your eyes wider. Mollie Hemingway is the editor-in-chief of The Federalist. You know, Mollie, I know it sounds like the obvious point to make, but sometimes you just have to hammer the obvious point. How can or should any of these people or any of these institutions ever be trusted on any subject?
That's exactly the main takeaway that people should have from what we've witnessed in the last week. As you note, hours before last week's debate, you had many members in corporate media claiming that stories and video evidence of Joe Biden's problems with senility and mental acuity were a conspiracy theory, that they were misinformation and disinformation. They aren't telling the truth now. All that's happened is that our media are worried about their ability to drag Joe Biden across the finish line in November. And so now they are, yes, telling some accurate things about Joe Biden's mental situation, but it's not because they're truth tellers. It's because they seek power and they realize that the task has become too difficult with Joe Biden at the head of the party.
And it makes me wonder, Mollie, I think any of us that do this for a living want this thing that we do.
So I saw an earlier interview this morning where Will Cain and Howard Kurtz, the Fox News media critic, were both being interviewed, and Will Cain just took up so much time with his low IQ perspectives that Howard Kurtz barely got to say anything.
For a living to be better than the sick state it's in today, media, right? And so you do wonder, well, will the public ever understand if they're willing to go to these extents to lie on the capacity of the leader of the free world? Won't they go to these same lengths on any other number of subjects and the public open their eyes about the media?
Right. People have been talking about.
Well, why didn't the conservative media blow this story wide open and substantiate it?
Pretty serious media bias, since the 60s even. In the 80s, it was a big deal. What we've seen in the last 6 to 8 years goes well beyond bias into outright propaganda and lying on behalf of political allies and against political opponents. It's not just that they lied about Joe Biden's situation because they worried that if they were to tell the truth that it might help Republicans. It's that they lie about every single issue of importance, and they've been doing it for years, they're doing it now, and they're going to do it in the future. And so Americans who care about their country, who are worried about the situation that we're in because of these media lies, should be thinking long and hard about whether to take anything they say with any degree of trust, barring other evidence. And I just want to point out, if what they were saying is true right now, and if they're really concerned about Joe Biden's mental acuity, why aren't their stories focused on the fact that he's currently the sitting president, instead of just that they're worried that he's currently the nominee for the 2024 election? To overstate the obvious, if he...
Elliot Blatt says, bro, conservative talk radio has been all over this. Yeah, they've been all over this by sharing their opinions and their common sense, but they haven't substantiated the story, right? Saying that we never landed on the moon, right? Various people like the equivalent of Alex Jones have been all over that story, but they never substantiated it. So just being all over a story by giving your opinions does not advance a story, right? It's just giving your opinions.
He can't run for president. He can't be president for the next 7 months. He can't be in charge of our military. He can't, we've got a very delicate global situation. And yet the media are just focused on the political horse race because that's what they care about, political power, not the country's well-being.
Absolutely. They're ready to tell this truth, not because they're concerned about the country, but they're concerned about their ability to win.
Okay. Pretty low IQ analysis there from Fox News.
Because we're somehow not sure. We're somehow not sure that our own eyes are telling us the truth. And we see with our own eyes the advisor.
So I think that's too harsh there on Elliot Blatt's point. Right. The good thing about conservative talk radio is all sorts of things that one sees as an obvious truth, such as Joe Biden's cognitive decline, can be discussed and validated in the talk radio community. So if you have narratives and they find no support in your life, all right, you're going to lose those narratives. All right. You have to have support for your stories, for your narratives, for your perspectives on the world, and talk radio provided support for a very valid and important perspective that Joe Biden was cognitively not up to the task of being president of the United States. So yeah, good on talk radio for creating that space and creating a community where such obvious truths could be discussed and shared.
And the courtiers of the emperor who are walking along pretending as if he's wearing some fine suit of clothes. So we say, okay, I'm not going to trust my own judgment, my own knowledge. I'll just go along until, and this is what
right, those things that you can't say out loud, such as group differences, right? They start not getting believed as clearly, right? If you can't say something out loud, it won't have as much reality for you. And so you need to find a community where you can discuss obvious truths such as group differences. Joe Biden is mentally incapacitated.
Facts, common knowledge. This is what changes common knowledge. Common knowledge being what we all know, that we all know. It's not what we all know, because we all know the guy's naked. We're not doing anything different. But when that little girl in the crowd yells out.
So when right-wingers say, look, we need to be saying more of these things out loud, right? They've got a good point. Now, I don't want right-wingers ruining their life doing that, but truths that you can't say out loud, they cease being truths for many people.
So loudly that everyone believes that everyone else in the crowd heard that little girl say that the emperor's naked. That's where everything changes. And the crucial thing here is that little girl, and in game theory terms, we call that little girl a missionary, because you get up in front of all the tribespeople, like a missionary going to some tropical island, you get in front of everybody and you make this announcement where everybody hears you speak. That's the crucial thing. The crowd sees and hears that the crowd knows that the emperor is naked. And that's where everything changes.
You had a great quote in your piece. Behavior changes only when we believe that everyone else believes the information. That's what changes behavior. And I was thinking about my reaction, like if I had to rate Joe Biden's cognitive abilities before and after the debate, it's probably not that different. So nothing changed, but by the same token, everything changed. Because I think people probably don't think it's that different than it was before, but people's willingness to vote for him, the way people see this is completely changed, even though the facts behind the scenes may not have changed that much.
That's right. And so I wrote a note today of Joe Biden in the common knowledge game, but that quote that you just had, Jack, about how everything changes in our behavior once we believe that everyone else believes it, that line is actually from a much earlier.
Yeah, you can see a difference in people's behavior in their confidence when they find a talk radio community and they become a little less afraid of being called racist, and they find a community where they can share obvious truths out loud and get support and not feel so isolated.
Earlier note I wrote about Harvey Weinstein, because I find that these real life examples, as good as The Emperor's New Clothes as a story, and as much as we all know the story, tying it back to a real world case that we also know, I find can be really powerful. So the fact is, with Harvey Weinstein, everyone in Hollywood knew he was a rapist and a really bad guy. It wasn't that they all knew the emperor was naked. They all knew that Harvey Weinstein was a rapist.
Right, we got a hilarious new video from Donald Trump. Let's play this.
Amazing. That old broken down pile of crap. Yeah. It's a bad guy. He just quit, He's quitting the race.
Is that right?
Yep, I got him out of the race. And that means we have Kamala. I think she's going to be better. She's so bad. She's so pathetic.
It's so amazing.
It's just so fucking bad. So
I just can't imagine.
But can you imagine that guy dealing with Putin and the president of China, who's a fierce person? He's a fierce man.
Right.
A very tough guy, and they see him. They probably he can't. But they just announced he's probably quitting.
Good.
Really?
Yeah, that's amazing.
Just keep knocking him out, right?
So I admire and I'm heartened by how disciplined Donald Trump has been in staying out of the news and just allowing the Democrats to self-immolate.
What did I do with the debate the other night?
Amazing.
Kick that old broken down pile of crap.
Yeah.
It's a bad guy. He just quit, He's quitting the race.
Is that right?
Yep, I got him out of the race. And that means we have Kamala. I think she's going to be better. She's so bad. She's so pathetic.
It's so amazing.
It's just so fucking bad. So
I just can't imagine.
But can you imagine that guy dealing with Putin and the president of China, who's a fierce person? He's a fierce man.
Right.
A very tough guy. And they see him. They probably he can't.
All right, let's get back to the learned discussion here.
I mean, they're making jokes about it on 30 Rock. I mean, so it's not like it was, some
Harvey
big
Weinstein,
state secret
rapist.
that Harvey Weinstein was a really bad guy. And by know about it, I mean, it was his business partners, his wife, actors, politicians, they all knew. But so long as it was private knowledge, no matter how widespread, it didn't matter. No one changed their behavior. Nobody turned down a role. No politician turned down a donation. Nobody said, "Oh, you're not welcome at our party." None of that happened until you had a missionary, in this case it was Rose McGowan, goes out, and because she was also very famous, and because she said it so loudly, just like that little girl in the Emperor's New Clothes parable or story, everybody heard it. All the people who had been holding this inside, who knew it to be true, their whole world changed because now they knew that everyone knew. And then their behavior changed immediately. His wife divorces him. His business partners go, "Oh, we're shocked that, Harvey Weinstein's a rapist." Even though we know they already knew. They had been approving all the settlements for raping people. They were the ones who were increasing their director and officer insurance. Right? They knew. So everything about their behavior changed once you had the missionary say it so loudly and so publicly, even though nothing changed in what they already knew. It's exactly your point, Jack, right? I mean, I was watching this and I was saying, okay, I know what I think about Joe Biden's cognitive abilities, his mental competence for the job, but I'm still kind of leaning towards the guy, honestly. And then we all saw what we all saw. And you could just see the common knowledge change around you. And it changed everything about how I think. That was the point of our breaking news episode last week. I had already gotten to the point was, sorry, I can't do it anymore. I can't do it anymore. I can't support the guy. And that same sort of realization, which is very sad and terribly, I think, distressing, was felt by millions of people. But that's exactly the process, Jack. You're exactly right.
It was interesting to me too, like how important, and you touched on this on Twitter, how important the reaction, like John King on CNN was. Like what they did right after the debate was over, it wasn't just what we had all seen. It was, Democrats are scrambling behind the scenes. They're trying to replace him. Barack Obama's on the phone. Like, can you talk about that, how important that was?
Yeah, so, our friend Tom Morgan wrote a note, and he was tweeting me about this the other day about a great example of that, of the crowd starting to respond in the middle of the speech. Because I don't know about you, if you were watching, a lot of people watched it in a small group. We knew that we were part of an enormous crowd. We knew that there were how many tens of millions of people watching it. And we also mostly watched it with other people. I had our family, friends, people would go to a watch party, something like that. So you were part of a crowd, and you're starting to feel the crowd around you respond to what happened, just almost immediately. For me, it was my Twitter feed started blowing up. I started making a few tweets also. I mean, just 3 minutes in, it's like, oh my God, what is going on here? And maybe you got it from your social media. Maybe you got it from somebody texting you, hey, are you watching this thing? Maybe you were watching it you started to hear the murmurs of whatever group you were with watching the debate. So the crowd starts to hear the crowd respond. And I mentioned our friend Tom Morgan, because he was tweeting me about another case like this, which was Nicolae Ceausescu, the dictator of Romania. This is 1989. He starts giving a speech, it's a televised speech, and the audience starts yelling back at him. And they start heckling him. And he starts yelling back at the audience. And this is all being televised. And within like a week, the government falls. It's done. It's done. And it's all because the crowd, that crowd at the Palace Square, whatever it was called in Romania, in Bucharest, it gets televised to the much larger crowd. The crowd sees a crowd responding in a certain way, and that's what drives this common knowledge formation. So all of us, the crowd, we're seeing other crowds start to respond in real time to the talk. And the most, I think, impactful crowd was what you're mentioning, Jack, the CNN panel immediately at the conclusion of the debate, where, and these things are very scripted and very highly produced. So everyone knows what's happening, and they go directly to John King, and he says, right off the bat, no hemming or hawing, no talking about, says, what I'm hearing, again, he's not giving his direct opinion. He's telling you what he's hearing from his crowd. What I'm hearing is that Biden needs to go right off the bat. And so these are the kind of little missionaries. This is the crowd watching the crowd itself give the reaction. And that's what makes the trickle into a tidal wave.
When he says it that way, what I'm hearing, there's something else I feel like that happens in that moment. Because when he says what I'm hearing, everybody else who's watching it goes, hey, me too. Like there's an incredible validation that happens in that little moment. There's a ripple effect.
That's exactly right. And it's very intentional. And you'll see it all the time on these panels of talking heads and the like. There are only a few people who have I call it the missionary star power to say, I think X. And the missionary throughout this whole thing, one of those people with that incredible missionary star power, was in fact Joe Biden himself. I mean, Joe Biden was himself the little girl saying, oh my God, the emperor has no clothes. And saying it so loudly. And then, Matt, you're absolutely right. So
Nate Silver thinks it's obvious that Joe Biden must resign. And his tweet, it's an alliance of the center and the left against extremely dumb hacks. At this point, the hacks meaning the Joe Biden administration.
So everyone else who wants to have a voice, and that's why they're panelists on these CNN things. They're good at this. John King's very good at this. And he's not inserting me what John King thinks, because as recognizable as he is, he doesn't have the missionary star power that a Biden does, and Obama does, that pretty much anyone does. I'm hard pressed to think of anyone on those panels that has that kind of independent missionary power. So what you do, you say, well, I'm talking to other people. Other influential people are telling me this is a disaster, this is a problem, the guy's got to go. And it is incredibly validating, Matt, in both the way you describe that, okay, he's also hearing from other people, just like I was on my, Twitter feed or DMs or the like. I'm hearing that too. And we humans are hardwired to respond powerfully if.
So we got a comment in the chat. How did Americans spot Joe Biden's cognitive decline? Meaning this overseas perspective is that Americans are a bunch of morons.
We see a group of other humans behaving in a certain way. We are literally hardwired to respond that way. So that when John King says, I'm hearing from lots of people, it's exactly why Trump says,
right, we're wired to be social animals, right? We're wired to live our lives in the middle of the mob, not to be pursuing an individualist strategy just off on the margins.
Many people say, everyone says, it's the same reason the New York Times says, experts say. That construction that linguistic construction to say that lots of people are saying something, it's very powerful. And it changes the way we think about things.
And also with someone like John King, my assumption in watching it is these are very powerful people. He seems to be a very connected guy, at least the way you watch it. So it's like he's talking to high level people or something. At least I don't know if that's true, but that's the way I saw it, like watching it.
Of course, and it's the power of someone on a stage or behind a microphone or in front of a camera. We ascribe to them a importance.
Right. We have a common knowledge moment where something that only conservatives were noticing is now.
I'm just going to be honest. I mean, everybody comes on the air and says all this great stuff, but behind the scenes, it's full-scale panic. People are passing around legal memos, PDFs are flying back and forth on WhatsApp, trying to figure out what are the options, how can you replace Biden, how do you get him to do it in a way where he feels respected as he should be respected, who should Kamala Harris's vice president be. The conversation on air and the conversation off air are completely different. And so it's the same thing you saw with the Trump situation, where people would come on air and defend Trump, and then you talk to people, and we got a crazy candidate. We don't have a crazy candidate. We have a great candidate. We have a beautiful man. We have someone who loves this country. We have someone who has given his all, I mean his all, to the last drop for this country, but he may not be able to get across the finish line. And a mature party has to take that into account, and that is what's happening. And so, look, I understand people want to, defend him and protect him and give him their space.
Right. Van Jones is a compelling commentator, right? The guy just oozes charisma, and a disproportionate number of the most charismatic people, right, who most compel your attention are black, right? Just charisma oozing out the pores.
That whether it's true or not, I mean, maybe it's his John King's uncle who's texting him. I don't think so, right? But yes, that's exactly right, Jack. It's all designed to give you that impression because we're hardwired to respond positively to it.
Once something like this becomes common knowledge, is there anything that could be done? I mean, is there an appearance on 60 Minutes he could do? Is there a better performance in the next debate? Is there anything that can be done at this point?
Nope. I mean, I'd love to tell you there is, but the short answer is no, there's not. You can't. And the reason I say that, and the reason I say that so emphatically and definitively, is it goes back to this notion of game theory, that there are rules to these games. And this is the games for whether it's common knowledge or, we've all heard probably of the prisoner's dilemma game, the game of chicken. There are rules to these games, and they have, right, $10 phrase alert, an equilibrium outcome. And all that means is they have a stopping point. They have a winner. I mean, it may not be a winner, right? But it is a stopping point. It's a stopping point. It may not be a permanent stopping point, but it's a strong stopping point. That's all that phrase means, an equilibrium. So there is an equilibrium to the common knowledge game. It takes a lot to move it. It takes a lot to form it. But once it's formed, it's quite stable. So there's no unringing this bell.
Yeah, Joe Biden is sunk.
And I'll prove it to you, which is that we're all looking for Biden's next flub. We're all looking for it. I'm saying, I'm right. I'm right. And I know I'm right because CNN was looking for it that night. So they keep the cameras on after the debate is over. Trump walks off the stage. Jill Biden comes on. Good job, honey. The cameras stay on. The cameras linger. The cameras are waiting and watching to see how does he exit the stage. And sure enough, he needs help getting down 3-inch stairs. Steps, not stairs, steps, 2 steps. He needs help. It was not an accident that the camera was on. It was no accident that whole night the commentator said, no, let's flip back to, Jill and Joe are doing their little post-celebratory thing there with the crowd. It's no accident they all went back there. It's no accident the cameras were on. Because now this is the game. We're all waiting for the next inevitable flub and moment of frailty and cognitive decline. And it's going to come because we all know it. That's the other reason why this was so powerful. Don't try to tell me, oh, he had a cold or, oh, he had a raspy voice. We've all had parents and grandparents. We've all had this conversation with our partners and spouses and siblings about what to do We all know it. We all know he's got a stutter. And we all know this ain't that. We all know it. And after Thursday night, we all know that we all know. And so it never goes away. This is the new equilibrium. This is the new outcome. For the rest of his life, Joe Biden is going to be watched. Every public statement, every public step, every public appearance, people are watching him for the fuck up. I mean, can you imagine how awful it would be to have to go through life like that? And I think that's what makes a lot of us so angry. That's what makes a lot of us so angry.
I want to take this to the zeitgeist because I think this is the question. This is no longer where, so as a person with a lot of background in improvisational things in my life.
All right, so these guys specialize in the power of narrative. And a good tweet here, Biden technically has the power to decide if he stays in the race, but this ignores the underlying fact that the Democratic National Committee never plays by the rules. May take a bit, but if the Democratic National Committee power brokers have decided they want Biden out, I believe he will ultimately be out.
And stuff like this. The beauty about doing something that's improvisationally based, to be it like music or jazz or anything, improv comedy, if you want, in front of a group, is the audience is basically rooting for you to fail and then delighted with surprise when you succeed. But the tension is created by, you can't possibly do this.
100%.
This is not that. This is, you can't possibly do this. And I'm kind of rooting for the failure in the, there's no speech where he turns around and all of a sudden it's like, oh, he's back.
So Nellie Bowles is a liberal. She writes for the Free Press. And here's her piece today, the opening. When the legacy media encounters inconvenient fact, Biden's age, say, or Hunter's laptop, or the lab leak, or the complexity of puberty blockers, or the riots of the summer of 2020, it likes to take some time to process the problem and arrive at a professional consensus. So reporters need to discuss the issue over dinner, to wring their hands about what to do, to get yelled at for possible thought crimes by a righteously angry intern, mull some more, get yelled at again by another intern, to have more drinks and more meetings. There is no rush to tell the American public about anything inconvenient. It's important to be careful to keep that information private for a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years.
Back. There's no off night from this. You said it. You said in the piece, no Democrat who sees a future for themselves in politics is going to commit wholeheartedly to the Biden-Harris campaign now. This is the zeitgeist. What the heck happens next?
The campaign is finished. The 2024 Biden-Harris campaign is finished. They may not know it yet, but it's done. It's over. You can't be, this is not fixable. You can't go out the next day and read a speech from a teleprompter and people say, oh, he's fine. Not after Thursday night. You could before, and that's what, like the State of the Union, when he gets out there and he reads from a teleprompter. Great, he can read.
There's no surprise and delight of the crowd from that success. This is the problem here. There's only...
Nope.
Yeah.
Nope, exactly. We're all done, and everybody will notice, oh, well, he's just reading from the teleprompter. And everyone, every media, every reporter is now looking for the flub. No one's trying to cover it up anymore. No one's trying to look away. Nobody's trying to say, oh, it's just partisan. Everyone's looking for it. Everyone's looking for it. And they're going to find it because he's 81 freaking years old and we all know what's going on. We all know what's happening here. So what's next, Matt, is it's over. And it's over, but it's in no one's advantage who sees a future for themselves in Democratic politics to say it's over. You don't want to be the guy that's seen as sticking the knife into Biden's back. But at the same time, you do not want to be associated with it. Every one of Biden's cabinet appointees, they're like Harvey Weinstein's business partners. They knew. They've known all along. But now it matters because we all know that we all know. So they're trying to distance themselves. Every one of them is trying to distance themselves. They'll say nice things in public.
Yeah.
But I promise you, every one of them is trying to flee this sinking ship as fast as humanly possible.
Okay, great analysis there from a new YouTube channel that I've discovered called Epsilon Theory. It's an analysis of the power of narrative. That's going to do it for me. Take care.